the last 12 days, the president has made several comments about the National Football League, Harvey Weinstein, the stock market, Hillary Clinton, the Electoral College, without ever saying a word or tweeting a word about Staff Sergeant Brian Black, Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson, Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright, and Sergeant LaDavid Johnson, who were killed in the line of duty in Niger. Not one word. And today, the president claimed that he has written letters to the families of those soldiers and then said he wasn't sure if those letters would be sent today or tomorrow. Now, America has every right to believe the president was lying about those letters because he lied about a lot of things today in the Rose Garden. And there is no reason why those letters wouldn't be sent immediately after they were written. The president might know that while he's been busy tweeting about football, he has not actually signed letters to the families of those soldiers. He might know that, and that might be why he said he wasn't sure when those letters were being sent. There was the usual stream of lies as the president spoke today in the Rose Garden.
You look at other countries, what they've done, and we're competing with other countries. When China's at 15%, when I hear that Ireland is going to be reducing their corporate rates down to 8% from 12%, but you have other countries also reducing. We can't be at 35% and think we're going to remain competitive in terms of companies and in terms of jobs.
I hear that Ireland's not reducing its corporate tax rate. Ireland's corporate tax rate is at 12.5%. The Irish finance minister said last week that that rate will not be reduced. That's what we heard Ireland say last week. China's corporate tax rate is 25%, not the 15% that the president just lied about. And before the Rose Garden today, the president said this in the cabinet room.
Obamacare is finished. It's dead. It's gone. It's no longer, you shouldn't even mention, it's gone. There is no such thing as Obamacare anymore.
And he wonders why at least one of the cabinet members in that room today, listening to that, has reportedly called him a moron. Joining us now is James Fallows, Europe editor for The Atlantic and a former speechwriter for President Jimmy Carter. Also joining us is Daniel Day, Washington correspondent for the Toronto Star. Jim, having worked in a White House, I can only imagine what it feels like to you to watch a president in these rooms, in the cabinet room, in the Rose Garden, with this just relentless stream of lies about anything.
As you know, in normal circumstances, everything that comes out of a president's mouth is so hyper-checked because the idea that he would make a factual mistake is something that everybody takes very seriously. And then there's this other business about the soldiers in Niger. Again, as you know, there's nothing that presidents, regardless of party, take as more just a grave obligation as the troops who are fighting and dying under their command. So Republican or Democrat, every previous president has been in touch with those soldiers, those casualties, and their families right away.
And when he said today that President Obama never made any calls about this, he immediately got a tweet from an Obama staffer saying that that was an absolute lie.
And it's a lie of the gravest sort for somebody who bears this commander-in-chief responsibility. Again, you can agree or disagree with the politics of any president, but all the ones I've seen or known about, they take this really deep in their hearts, and he's just lying about it.
Yeah, cavalierly lying about it. Let's listen. Daniel, I know you've been reporting extensively on Puerto Rico, and I want to listen to something that the president said about Puerto Rico today.
Their electrical grid was destroyed before the hurricanes got there. It was in very bad shape, was not working, was in bankruptcy, owed $9 billion. And then on top of that, the hurricane came. Now, you're going to have to build a whole new electrical plant system.
Daniel, your reaction to that?
This is the third time in less than 2 weeks that Trump has claimed that the government was going to have to rebuild power plants in Puerto Rico. In the past 2 instances, he's claimed that the plants were wiped out, destroyed. In fact, the plants were barely touched. They were barely damaged. The problem was with the rest of the grid. And so this is the kind of daily dishonesty that we get from Trump that is only occasionally treated as a story. You know, we got headlines today about a Trump lie because his lie about Obama supposedly not calling military families was sufficiently new and sufficiently ghastly to merit headlines in the eyes of much of the media. But what we're seeing is a daily avalanche of dishonesty. You know, I've been counting since he took office. He said 40 inaccurate things 2 weeks ago. He said 34 inaccurate things last week. And these things are only occasionally talked about. His dishonesty is treated as kind of a sideshow to his presidency, when I think it is a central story of the presidency that I think a lot of people and a lot of the press have unfortunately become kind of immune to.
Daniel makes such a good point that there's the one big lie that came out of the Rose Garden today about President Obama. And I do want to just read this tweet that Alyssa Mastromonaco wrote. She she was deputy chief of staff in the Obama White House after President Trump lied about President Obama not calling and reaching out to soldiers' families killed in action. She said, "That's an effing lie to say President Obama or past presidents didn't call the family members of soldiers killed in action. He's a deranged animal." And Jim, the reason I wanted to read that is that is not the way former White House officials like yourselves and others talk. They have to be driven to that by something extreme.
Exactly, and this connects to something that David Jolly was saying in the previous segment, that the Republicans in Congress are the ones who have the power to do something about this. So we see these two conflicting trends. On the one hand, people like former Obama aides, people like the Secretary of State being driven to say this is just abnormal, and the Congress still being unwilling to act. So when that tension resolves itself is what a lot of our future depends on.
You know, Daniel, when I was watching the Rose Garden today, I thought the only way to cover this is literally with the list of lies, as well as the important thing that was going on there, which was this fake friends meeting with Mitch McConnell. And that means, for me, leaving out all the stuff about the NFL, just a bunch of stuff that was said in the Rose Garden today, because that actually starts to camouflage and get in the way of a clear view of just how many rank lies this man told in the Rose Garden today.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think the only way for journalists to approach this president is to come armed with facts. The good thing, if you will, about Trump's lying is that he tells the same lies over and over. It's not like these are unpredictable. And so I think something really interesting happened today. He was challenged on the claim about Obama. NBC's own Peter Alexander said, "How can you make that claim?" And what was fascinating to me was that Trump immediately backed down. He said, "Well, I don't know. He probably did sometimes." We also saw that in a Forbes interview recently where Trump claimed, no one has hit 3% GDP growth in a quarter. Obama never hit that. The Forbes journalist said, in fact, Obama did hit that in several quarters. And Trump, again, immediately backed off it. So I think what these two instances, sort of back-to-back, show is that this lying doesn't have to stand. We in the media can call him on it, and that can achieve something. I think journalists have been too passive and too complacent about this lying that, again, I think is a defining feature of this presidency and needs to be treated as such.
Yeah, Peter Alexander did a great job of jumping on. And you see, Trump goes to that thing of, well, people tell me.
Yes,
that was his response when Peter challenged him on this crazy assertion about President Obama.
And his experience so far is it doesn't matter. During the campaign, he was just saying lies several times an hour. The NFL told me the debate schedule was wrong. The NFL says, no, we didn't, et cetera. Right. And so the question is whether it starts to add up. And there's the potential that this Niger soldier and Obama comment might be something that begins moving the Senate.
And within all this, there's also the outrageous story that the president has simply ignored these soldiers killed in action for these 12 days. He has just publicly ignored them. And Daniel, that is getting kind of lost within this coverage that has emerged from what happened today in the Rose Garden.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about Trump is that by virtue of his outrageousness and often his dishonesty, he brings attention to things that make him look bad. There's this kind of distraction theory. Oh, Trump is this master puppeteer who's taking our attention away from things that make him look bad. I think in many cases, he actually drives attention to it. So people might not have heard anything about these soldiers or very little. And now Trump has created this absurd controversy by virtue of his extreme dishonesty. And now people are, Googling these soldiers' names. So if there's a benefit to this dishonesty, it is that.
Daniel Dale, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.